All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jason Grandelli, and I'm an engineering manager at Meta, where I support teams that focus on the core architecture of the Facebook mobile apps. I'll be moderating our final panel today, where we're going to discuss cross-platform product development. With me, I have Denise Noyes, Kevin Galligan, Dan Schafer, and Vishnu Nath. Real quick, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Denise Noyes is an engineer on the video infrastructure team at Meta, focused on our client libraries for video playback and creation across the Meta family of apps. Kevin Galligan is the founder and technical partner of TouchLab. He and his team are focused on many facets of Kotlin multi-platform tech, including research, open source libraries, private client applications, and community advocacy. Much of their current work is focused on the larger team application of KMP technology. Dan Schafer is the co-creator of GraphQL and a director of engineering at Meta, where he works on the mobile platform team building frameworks to power mobile experiences across the family of apps. Vishnu is currently a general manager at Microsoft working on OneNote in the Office product group. Vishnu has experience building cross-device experiences and partnerships that bridge ecosystems, most recently with Microsoft and Samsung. All right, with that out of the way, we're going to start with our first question, a little softball. Why is cross-platform product development important?
I'll jump in right out of the gates. I think as we look at cross-platform development, it's always about meeting our customers where they are, and meeting our customers on all of their devices really helps us get that experience to a point where they get to express that experience on no matter what device they're using, whether it's a Android phone or it's an iPhone or it's an iPad, a Windows PC. The experience needs to be able to transcribe across these experiences for customers to really have a way to experience them across their entire life and all their devices.
It's interesting, Vishnu. You talked a little bit about the importance to the users. I actually view it almost from the opposite angle, which is the importance to developers. I think about some of the experiences that we're trying to build and what it would look like to try and build these across, both iOS and Android or other devices. And just the fact that we have cross-platform development allows us to build experiences that we wouldn't necessarily be able to otherwise, just because how are we going to build it twice? And so the focus on users makes a ton of sense to me. I think from the angle, especially of building the frameworks, a lot of it, boils down to the developers.
And I think even beyond the developers, like working on the product, I think the blast radius is even larger because you have all of the partner teams and infrastructure that you work with kind of having a product and client layer that works consistently across platforms. They don't have to waste a lot of energy dealing with the idiosyncrasies of each platform. And then even the users, beyond just getting an experience that I think feels native and kind of consistent with what else is on their device, they also hopefully get more features, more stability, because the developers have increased velocity from doing this cross-platform work.
Yeah, I wanted to throw in a thing here too, which I kind of look at this. It's like I got obsessed with this. Really, is more of a even sorts of philosophical question. Like we were so accustomed to developing each platform in isolation, and it's like if you didn't have to do that, or you could reduce the reasons why that you have to do that, it would be sort of crazy not to. And the reasons we don't are generally technical barriers and things that make that difficult. So it's if you can figure out ways to reduce that or improve that situation, it becomes increasingly crazy not to, but it is because it is sometimes so difficult to accomplish that we don't, or that we sort of rail against it. But definitely from a developer perspective, if you didn't have to, you certainly wouldn't do multiple platforms in isolation.
It also comes very naturally. I think of 10 or 15 years ago, where in particular, well, I guess at the time it was Facebook rather than Meta, is purely thinking about web. I couldn't even imagine okay, we're building for web, so we'll build separately for Windows and for Mac and for Linux. Now you're building for web, you do have this common platform, and you might have some affordances that recognize the fact that you're on a different one, but the one experience that powers multiple platforms was just the default then, and that shifted over the last 10 years as we've gone to mobile. But I think the proliferation of these cross-platform technologies has demonstrated that that's not an inherent aspect of the medium. That's just a decision that we've made so far.
Okay, that sounds really compelling. So lots of reasons why it's important. Okay, so next up, I want to understand how you all think about building these cross-platform experiences to get the most out of those superpowers, the efficiency, provide a consistent experience for our users, but also respecting the platforms that you're developing for, and making sure that the product feels at home on those platforms, or doesn't, depending on if that's your goal.
Well, I'll jump in here and saying that I think I'm well, somewhat unique on the panel in the sense that we come at this from a very particular technology focus, and it's primarily around the idea that it's starting from not trying to do everything at once. It's not trying to do the entire platform or have one UI or everything is one that's code based. It is sharing the logic and parts that you can productively without forcing you to lock in a single experience that doesn't make sense on multiple platforms. So it's like, how do we avoid that? It's like, it's baked into the philosophy of what we do. So it's an easy answer for me. Everybody else perhaps is going to have a more complicated answer.
I think there's a little bit of an art form in it too, of how do you leverage what's native and unique to each platform that you're on, but still deliver a coherent customer experience that's relevant for the app that you're working on. And so for me, if I look at an experience like inking in OneNote, so the app that I'm currently general manager of is OneNote. It's a note-taking app. If I'm using a pen on a Windows device and inking and using it as a journal to be able to take notes in a meeting or a gratitude journal that I might do in the evening, and then I switch over to an iPad or I switch over to an Android phone and want to quickly jot a note on my lock screen, there might be certain gestures or native facilities to how inking behaves on those different platforms that I'd want to support. But at the same time, if I'm moving across these devices, how do I do so in a coherent way that I know how to erase something, or I know how to lasso control something, or that my handwriting recognition operates in the same manner as it does across platform, and how much of that can be in shared code and logic that I'm implementing once and using everywhere, versus having to really double click on what's native to the platform that I can really make the best experience for that particular device and my app.
For me, it's interesting kind of working on a product infrastructure layer that's kind of closely coupled to kind of media capabilities that differ very strongly per platform. Kind of how do you make use of shared code and shared components? And you kind of have to clearly carve out places where you're going to have to integrate with platform specific APIs, and you can't do things consistently. So the way that you decode video, for example, can differ pretty significantly between Android and iOS. But you can also carve out components that don't need to be platform specific. Like, for example, we don't need to build multiple bandwidth estimation models that may have just organically grown up differently because the folks working on it originally on Android had different ideas than the people working at it on iOS. There are kind of some foundational things that can be shared. So again, there is some art form to being able to identify the common pieces that you can carve out, and then be able to jump into the platform specific code kind of behind clear interfaces in a way that makes things easy for the product engineers that build on top of you.
Especially from the framework perspective, and it's building a little bit on what he said. I think the places where you're opinionated have to be chosen very carefully, because if you're too opinionated about when you have to go to platform specific, you end up losing a lot of the benefits of developing cross-platform. Similarly, if you are not opinionated enough, you end up taking away some of the capabilities where if you do want to do something that is specific to iOS or specific to Android, you won't be able to because you're forced into a cross-platform environment. And so I think having sort of the layer of escape hatches where if you want to use a technology that nominally is cross-platform to build a purely iOS, purely Android, like it's not cross-platform at all, you probably should be able to do so, even though you're not getting a lot of the benefits. If you want to build one that is completely shared, like literally identical pixel for pixel between iOS and Android, you probably should be able to, even if it won't quite fit in with whatever design system. And then ultimately, you can choose for your product where along that spectrum you want to land.
Hey, Vishnu, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute. When we were speaking earlier, you mentioned, I recall, a feature that you're able to implement on Android and not iOS via some device capabilities. I'd love to hear how you dealt with that. I think it's pretty pertinent to this question.
Yeah, so one of the apps that we created at Microsoft was an app we used to call the Your Phone app. It's now called the Phone Link app. but it essentially enabled you to use your Samsung or Android device with your Windows PC in concert with each other, much like the iPhone and a Mac might work well together. And so we were trying to build this ecosystem between Android and Windows that would enable true seamless connectivity between the devices. So I could send text messages, I could make phone calls, I could access photos, I could even access any app running on my phone directly from my large screen desktop. So I was not switching between devices all day. And we saw an opportunity to be able to do this between Android and Windows because there were certain platform capabilities available. And through a partnership with Samsung, we actually got low-level OS access to be able to modify aspects of the operating system that weren't exposed to us that the OEM had access to that made this experience truly seamless. And we were really proud of the experience we created, but then we hit an interesting roadblock, even internally at our company, as well as with our customers, which was, hey, I've got an iPhone. What about me? Like, I want to use this app too. Like, and why aren't you, Microsoft, doing this? And, we, of course, wanted to work on every device, but at the end of the day, we weren't allowed or weren't able to partner with Apple to make that happen. And so we were really stuck in a tough position of having to choose where we could enable such a rich experience versus where we couldn't. And a lot of that came down to platform capabilities that were either available to us or were not. And it caused a lot of interesting conversations in turn for the team to figure out what would be in best service for the customer and best leverage the technology that was available to us.
That's really difficult. Because the platforms are all very different with their own capabilities, their own APIs, and their own limitations. Making sure that you can build the best possible customer experience, but also making sure that it's consistent and everybody feels like they're getting, kind of the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think platforms are an interesting aspect of it. I think another one is even trying to share things across apps and apps that sort of have very different characteristics. Where when I think of the problems across the family of apps that Meta supports, WhatsApp, Instagram, Messenger, Facebook, they all have incredibly different use cases just in terms of how much does scroll performance matter, which is probably a great deal on Instagram versus startup time, which is incredibly important in Messenger when you're opening up and trying to see a message. And so even on the same operating system, you can end up with very different architectures, not for like any sort of like organizational reasons, but for purely technical, like the apps have different constraints reasons. Well, then how do you develop sort of not just cross-platform, but also across these apps and glue them together? And again, you end up with similar problems of capabilities, working with the underlying system that can add some additional challenges to cross-platform development.
Yeah, even on the same platform, it gets tricky.
Let's throw another dimension in there. As a consulting company, it's like, imagine multiplying that across orgs that you've never met and politics, and everyone has different ideas about how to organize things and whatnot. But yeah, different app use cases, certainly. And this goes into something I assume is going to come later, perhaps for some reason. Why would I know what's coming? Some apps are very much content based, and it's a different thing than if you're doing a utility app and you're out in the field somewhere that you don't have connectivity or you're doing whatever. Some apps, the UI is not necessarily super critical. It just needs to work real solid. Some apps are consumer apps, especially totally different equation.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can move on to our next question. So now I think it's a really good time to talk about a success story that you've all had. I'd love to hear like a great success story. And while you're telling that story, if you can, try to highlight some of the keys to the success of that story for this cross-platform development. What made it successful?
I can take this one. I've got what I think is a pretty good example, and it is sort of across both platforms and apps. And it was some of the work that we were doing on Account Center, where we wanted to give an experience on Facebook, Instagram, Messenger, and really across iOS and Android. As you're thinking about your Facebook account, your Instagram account, what does it mean to be cross-posting between them? And what we wanted this to be truly consistent. If you open something up on Messenger for Android and Facebook for iOS and Instagram for, I don't know, pick whichever one of the OSs you want, it should feel like not just similar experiences, not just shared experiences, but the same experience. And this ended up being a really, really compelling use case for a cross-platform and cross-app technology, because it does allow us to build it once, deploy it across all 6 of these apps, make sure it's consistent, not just at a product behavior level, but at a just like animation level. What does it feel like for the bottom sheet to appear? What does it feel like as you sort of move between screens? And I think, this really was crucial for me in that when I envisioned trying to build sort of a product in a cross-platform framework, having that sort of shared experience ended up being crucial, because if it wasn't going to be shared at the UI layer, then when I think about sort of where does the rest of the logic break down, a lot of it is going to end up living on the server. Well, if it's living on the server, I don't necessarily need a cross-platform framework anyway. Is it going to end up living and interacting with a lot of the sort of core, frameworks and abstractions, the operating system? Well, in that case, I'm not gaining a lot of benefit from cross-platform. And so the fact that we had this, very shared, rich user-facing experience, I think was a really compelling use case for the cross-platform framework, and one that we continue to lean on going forward.
As I was saying earlier, it's consulting company. Can't really say names unless I get like approvals months in advance. So I'll keep it sufficiently general, but essentially working with a large org with a very mature set of apps and very mature teams that aren't necessarily like, don't want to pause for a week while you figure out your tooling and how to integrate stuff and try out new things that you're really excited about. And it essentially the keys, it was like getting something in there to start and introducing it in a way that doesn't slow anybody down or reduce the risk of builds breaking or, Xcode's not running or whatever that is. So you don't run into that. And giving that developer experience and the ability to include, things that at least to try this out. And it's like pick things that nobody wants to do, like, maybe analytics or logging or whatever that nobody's excited about and is very far away from the UI and can be pulled out very quickly and introduce it and show that it's not so bad. And then, let's say the other side of the development experience learns that they can actually contribute code to the one side, and everyone can kind of work on things together, and it's not going to slow down your development process. And then module after module gets kind of homogenized for things that, again, are critical and not necessarily very platform specific. So it was ensuring that you can put this into an environment with very low risk. Risk is a very big word that I think individual developers don't talk about much. But once you get into larger situations and orgs, it's a very, very important thing. So we lowered the risk and put it in there and showed that it wasn't going to blow anything up. And then it turned out to be something that they're using a lot more. Hopefully in several months, there's something really cool happening. I can't even remotely talk about now, but it'll be neat and public. So
I look forward to hearing about that.
So I was going to say,
go ahead, Denise.
No, so in my domain within video playback, again, we've seen some success trying to generalize some of the work that we do on adaptive streaming in a more cross-platform way. And again, we feel like it's enabled us to kind of level up the algorithms and the approach that we use, because we can kind of design it once, but then also increase the velocity of these partner teams that we're working with, because they're no longer trying to figure out like, oh, why am I seeing these really weird results on, say, like the iOS app only? And it's like, oh, well, that had this like weird rule that we added 3 years ago for this particular reason. And we never had any reason to purge Android. And now you have to like go through all these contortions. So looking for ways to kind of unify, in some cases, shard code, in some ways, even just semantically do the same thing and organize it underneath the same team, I think has been beneficial for the success of the organization to kind of move faster and do bigger and bolder things.
I think one example for us that just hearing from my fellow panelists talk about that resonated was the experience that we had building both cross-platform as well as cross-app, a common way to do something as simple as authentication, and having a common authentication library across all of our apps and cross-platform to enable our customers to do things like sign on once on the device and be able to single sign on into, successive other Microsoft apps on the device or partner apps that were using our authentication library. And it was a long path to getting, all of our disparate app teams to come together to be able to all agree on what should be in this library Does it meet the needs of all of our app teams? And is it cross-platform? And it gets revved and built centrally by one team. That's quite a multi-year journey that we were on to get there, but it's a success in that we eventually got to a point where we were able to get adoption to that and enabled a more seamless experience for our customers at the end of the day. And when it gets updated and revved and pushed out to all of our apps, we're not breaking each other on this contract for things like single sign-on. And getting telemetry or insights on where our funnels are breaking down and in our engagement funnels as well, and having that be shared across our apps allows us to compare and contrast where experimentation in one app may have led to an insight that we could use across the board in another app too. And having common platform and tooling for that has been really a success story for us in being a more mature mobile development company.
It's interesting. As I think about the examples we described, we almost described two different use cases for cross-platform development, which is, there are cross-platform frameworks that really allow you to build entire products in this cross-platform sense. You're sharing most of it, and maybe you're then specializing for specific interactions to match that sign pattern. But there are also cross-platform libraries that are almost built up from shared underlying primitives that we would then be able to use. This is more akin to the video library that I'm thinking of, or the login. Or, after I left the GraphQL team at Facebook, they started building up sort of shared, GraphQL caching layers and parsers and things like that could live in C++ and live across them. And it almost seems like we're building both from the bottom up and the top down. And at some point, we'll probably meet in the middle.
Okay, so we talked about why it's important. We talked about how to go about doing this, some successes, but obviously we talked in the very beginning. I heard someone talk about how this is not obvious for some people, and not exactly the first thing they reach for. I've ran into a lot of resistance myself when trying to do some of these things, both at Meta and other places. So I'd love to hear from all of you, like, what type of resistance have you faced when you've approached cross-platform development or even cross-app development, and how'd you deal with that?
I can go. I feel like
Might as well.
I have like the opposite thing, which is our whole existence, because we're like a consulting company that does one particular piece of cross-platform tech. So every engagement is like, hey, just so you know, not everyone's excited about this. Like, we might have to do some convincing or whatever. It is, we have a lot about this that we talk about. It start with, empathy of like, understand that not everyone necessarily is really excited about this. Why? It goes back to historical, right? Like a lot of the tools that if you're a mobile developer, and it's like, okay, I used PhoneGap in 2012, and that was a nightmare. And that means that's cross-platform. And then I maybe tried Xamarin to integrate it, or React Native, and it just didn't work out, right? And everyone's read, the Airbnb blog post about React Native, or the Dropbox thing about C++ or whatever. So it's this continual cycle of like, this doesn't work. But there's nothing about physics that prevents this from working. It's all the integration points and what the developer experience is like. And is it actually going to improve your developer life, or is it going to make it worse? So for us, it's like, talk to the team, understand what their concerns actually are, and address them in a way that isn't dismissive or not being honest, and talk about that. And then we talked about what the success was like, introduced it in a way that isn't going to make their lives demonstrably worse, certainly, and or if it's going to be painful, like, reduce the length of time that it's painful, and make sure that you do that well. And it's not always the best option. You need to be honest when the experiment isn't working, and I think those are all super critical. But I would say that our particular experience is pretty much that day to day, is talking to people about it. So
yeah, I think you're right that there's very much like a technical challenge and a people challenge, people problem to deal with. Like, so you have to understand what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So if you're going in and you're like, I'm going to make your life better because you don't have to build things multiple times, and the engineers are like, no, I don't want to use these tools. Why am I now having to use JNI to deal with C++? If it's Android, like, this sounds awful. You have to look hard, like, okay, day to day, is it actually solving the high level goal, which is to kind of improve your developer velocity? And if so, is this the right path? If there's a learning curve, how are you going to support that? How are you going to make sure that there's parity in the tools that people use to kind of debug and log and everything else? Our build time is going to regress. So there's kind of an understanding education support phase that needs to go into this, and it's not purely like a technical challenge.
I love calling out that it's not always the technical too. There's also this people and maybe an identity part of it. And we've seen this in pockets and different teams that I've been on where part of the team might identify themselves as, oh, we're the iOS team. Oh, we are the Android team, and we are responsible for this endpoint and the success of this endpoint. And it takes some level of management or restructuring of the team to say, no, there's a mobile team or there's some other horizontal that we're going to get common alignment on that shows that there's efficiencies for us to break this barrier of identity by platform as being the thing that we're going to identify as. And I think we've gone through all variations of this probably within different teams that I've been on at Microsoft, but that is a unique, maybe not so unique challenge, but a real people-centric challenge that you might have.
It's extremely common. Like, we our particular tech that we, work on is Kotlin. So it's kind of an Android thing. You can use it on iOS. And one of the things I'm very aware is if you don't, like, a lot of shared code situations turn into like some core team makes this SDK and then you consume it and it's all the way over here. And it never becomes a thing that you really touch or ever want to or ever have to. And it's always this arm's length thing where it and especially like C++ situation at Dropbox, to call it out. It was like this team that was doing this thing. No one ever joined the team. These people eventually leave and it becomes this like specialized knowledge that's impossible to recruit for. And it's awful. So we're very aware, like trying to make sure that the iOS folks like, okay, listen, I know that this is new and you can consume it without any pains, but you can also, we make an Xcode plugin. They can debug the Kotlin. They can slowly get accustomed to it. And it's quoting Jesse Wilson, who's one of the folks who's works on this a lot. It's giving the iOS team superpowers to be able to contribute back to the Android code. And then thinking of yourself as mobile developers, exactly what you said. We've seen interesting techniques, like somebody gets a mug for their first shared code contribution, and only the people that do it get the mug, that kind of, like, little things, but celebrate it. Anyway.
Man, I feel seen right now. In my younger years as an iOS developer, I definitely had that. This is my identity. You may not take my identity. So, wow, thank you for calling me out. I want to play a fun little game real quick because I picked up on something in all of your discussions. If you had to choose one and only one as the most difficult problem with code sharing, is it people or is it tech?
I mean, I think it's people, and it's not even close. Just in that, I think even if you just assume that you've gotten the technology right, you have a perfect technology which doesn't exist. It always has trade-offs. Like, and that's sort of the nature of it, is there's always going to be a trade-off. Anytime you're saying, hey, you're going to get this, it's not a free lunch. Like, something else is getting traded off. And somebody cares deeply about that thing that you were trading off. And so there's always going to be somebody whose identity was involved in a technology that you're replacing, or is involved in the OS, or the thing that they care deeply about. If I'm a huge iOS fan and I'm just like, this is not going to feel perfectly iOS. Well, it's a trade-off. We're going to be able to move twice as fast. Yeah, but I don't care about moving twice as fast. I want it to feel perfectly iOS. So I think even if you solve the technology, even if it's perfect, and it never is, like, the people battles are significantly harder.
I'll punt and say it's tech people. That's the I would say it's I totally agree. It's well, if the tech is terrible, then it's the tech, but then there's no problem because you're not going to use it. But it's people, but it's not just a cross-platform question. It's everything in the org, all of your users, like politics. It's always the people stuff's always the most difficult. Your personal relationships, like if the tech is perfect, then it's like, all right, listen, you just got to use it. But it's not. So it is definitely it's always people, and it's like you're going to have people that. It's always funny. I have this thing about these debates where everybody, well, especially tech people, I think because they work in tech, they think that they're more rational. This is a wild generalization. I apologize in advance. But so they're like, if I just keep explaining my argument, eventually you'll get it. And it's like, no, it's like the argument itself is not the problem. It's the beliefs and the preconditions about what you're talking about. That's where you don't agree. And so if you think that like in Kotlin, do you think Kotlin's cool? This is really neat. Like what would be the problem? And if you're an iOS dev who's like, I love Swift, you don't have value types, I don't even want to talk to you. Like, so it becomes, it's that kind of stuff. So people for sure.
I do think these two aren't as entirely separate, though, as the question might pose, which is ultimately, if you know that people are going to be the problem, or that is the problem, that can inform the design of your technology. If you've got a technology that's 90% there and you're like, I can get it to 100%, that might actually be the wrong call. Like, as I think about sort of the most important aspects of the technologies that I've worked on, oftentimes it is the escape hatches. It's the ability to say, okay, you disagree with the technical decision that we've made. That's fine. You can eject at this point. You can build it yourself. You have to match the spec in order for it to work, and that ends up being incredibly helpful as you sort of enter these situations where someone says, "Hey, I don't want to do it the way that you did it," and we'd be like, "Okay, that's fine. You can still use it," as opposed to that being just an immediate like, if I disagree with any technical decision you've made, I can't use your entire framework. And so I think a lot of the design choices that we make in our technologies are informed by the fact that we know that the people are going to end up being like a huge pull.
I think we're going to be in serious danger of you and I spending the rest of this panel agreeing and yes-anding. Yeah, I mean, it's primarily why like the tech that we're particularly focused on is because it's designed to be like, all right, you don't want to do that thing in shared, like it's easy to, okay, it's all it interops well, relatively well, as opposed to like there's other technologies that are designed to be like, you're going to use this thing and going outside of it actually is relatively difficult. So the escape hatch is one huge part of what I would call risk reduction. And if you can reduce the risk very low, then even if people aren't excited necessarily about the technology, it's easy to try it out without, because it's not, some people will argue just because they have an identity, but the majority of them are arguing because they're legitimately concerned. They've had bad experiences. They don't want to risk what they're doing because it's going to be a very big problem for them and the business and everything involved. So yes, escape hatches for sure. Absolutely.
Since I can't just jump in with people because that would be just boring, although I do want to agree, I'll take a slightly detoured path through people that ends up rooting us back on what's the path to delivering either more value to our customers or a better experience for our customers that brings along people to the path that and the tech choices that we will make to get to that net outcome. And the path that we take might start sometimes with a technology decision that's going to leave us to give us maybe more velocity or to be able to get more code out more quickly. Or it might actually be, no. The conversation needs to start with aligning on even a common set of goals of what we're trying to drive to be able to get the right intended outcome for what our customers will actually perceive and be able to react to seeing. And so I'll kind of touch on both a little bit there on the way out to saying, how do you focus on that end product, the end velocity, or what value you're reaching to the customer and how are they perceiving it?
And I think one last thing piggybacking on the people part is, again, I think when you have success, it's in part when the people who are in charge of building kind of the cross-platform libraries are also involved in the integration and running these in production. And it's not just this group sits over here and is going to build some platonic ideal of some library and then hand it off and expect everyone to use it and be happy and the villagers rejoice. There's, again, this legwork that you put in of, okay, you have to try it yourself, kind of understand the mindset of the developers and actually use it. That usually leads to greater adoption. Like, unless you are in some sort of like dictatorial environment where there's just an edict, you must use this, and then it'll get adoption, but people won't be happy about it.
From experience, you're 100% correct. Like, that's critical. I mean, if you're not there to support like the people using it, it's just it becomes very difficult. You know what I mean? It actually is interesting because it does turn into also like anything that goes wrong, even if it's not necessarily the shared thing, it becomes like your shared thing is suspect. And the further you are away from it, it's the unwelcome guest in the house, let's say. So.
Dan, I feel like you and I had that very conversation just last week.
Pretty much. Well, and ironically enough, I feel like a lot of what we just described doesn't necessarily or wasn't specific to cross-platform framework development. It was just sort of framework development and library development. I think the nature of cross-platform is sort of what Kevin mentioned, which is you have to be beyond reproach, because oftentimes people do approach it from a point of skepticism. Okay, I'm an iOS developer. I've been doing iOS development for 8 years. And here's the strange technology that says that my specialty isn't as quite as specialized as I thought it was. Like, people are going to start from a position of skepticism, and that's usually true for new frameworks or libraries, but even more so, I think, for cross-platform, which just means that the incentives for rolling out a framework or library are even more important than they usually are.
Yeah, I think we have time for one final question. So I just want to close this out and ask each of you, can you describe what makes an optimal cross-platform candidate and what makes a bad one? When would you invest in cross-platform, or when would you absolutely not?
I think for me, and I'm approaching from the framework perspective, it's the place where the UI is shared. I think, if the UI is shared, a lot of it's going to flow downhill from there. You're going to have sort of this pixel for pixel, shared experience. And I think in the reverse, I actually do view that in most cases as necessary and sufficient, where if the UI is not going to be shared, then I'm sort of looking and being like, what is the kernel that you're going to share? What's the kernel that isn't platform specific, in which case you've already lost a lot of the benefit of cross-platform, or offloadable to the server, in which case there's probably a lot of benefit in offloading it to the server. And so in cases like Account Center, where the UI is going to be shared, yes, this feels like a really, really compelling use case. And in a case where the UI wouldn't be shared, I probably wouldn't pursue a cross-platform strategy.
I'll go ahead. I was going to build on top of that by saying, for me, it's if I end up in too much of a lowest common denominator scenario where I've negatively impacted what could be a really good experience, or I've negatively impacted performance to a point that it's appreciably worse than it would be had I done another path. Those would be two things that would really jump out to me to say, was that really the best decision in service of the customer? Was that return on velocity actually worth it, or investment worth it? And I would tend to come back to that. Experience wins at the end of the day. And, are we able to deliver more experiences because of this, or are we shipping lower quality features because of that as well?
Yeah. I think building also on what Dan said, again, it's barely an all or nothing sort of thing. If you find yourself writing similar code across different code bases multiple times, maybe that's a candidate to look at for building some sort of shared SDK. But again, it's not the only option. Maybe there's ways to share more code server side for certain types of features and optimizations. Also looking at, I think, the performance characteristics. I think earlier it was mentioned, Messenger has very strong needs in terms of app startup performance, and scroll perf might be more important on Instagram. So I think, especially for certain media APIs and things too, also looking at what are the performance characteristics that you need, and are there any trade-offs or limitations you would have by maybe approaching that in a more cross-platform way. Could be a reason not to do it, again, as well as the needs of the developer and what's the problem that you're actually trying to solve.
I would say that if we're going to talk about generalized cross-platform, and especially things that are shared UI, then if you're not sharing the UI, or if they're not the same UI, then it would be kind of a relatively poor candidate. The technology we primarily focus on is really sort of bottom up. So it's sharing logic, which, some apps definitely don't do a lot of local logic or have any critical local logic. But I would say a lot of apps do, and whether, and some things sent to the server, I would also question sometimes things get sent to the server because people don't want to code them 3 times or whatever. But if you didn't have to, maybe they don't go to the server. Clearly, there's a bunch of things that should go to the server. I would say anything that's critically important to calculate, like taxes or something, and you absolutely don't want to mess it up, and you wanted to do a shared code with that makes a ton of sense. If you want to have a real native feel on iOS and Android and web, and you want to be able to do specific things in the platform, and you're not doing a lot of local, it would be a pretty bad choice.
Yeah, a lot of escape hatches, not a whole lot of shared there. Yeah, that resonates.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we're about at time. Everyone, thank you very, very much. We put a lot of prep into this. You all were fantastic. Amazing conversation. Thank you so much. That's the end of our panel for today. Coming up next are some closing remarks, and that should do it for the conference, I believe. Thanks everybody for watching. And again, panelists, I appreciate you.
Thank you.
Hey everyone. The panel concludes our first ever product at scale. I really enjoyed hearing from our speakers about the innovative ways their organization are solving complex problems, building products at scale. We hope today's presentation sparked new ideas and discussions for you. Thank you for the work that you do and for joining us here today. We look forward to collaborating with you in the future, and we hope you enjoyed today's program. I'd like to thank Maria Smith for opening our day and for our keynote speakers, Vijay and Ime. Thank you so much. To all our panelists, our speakers, and the planning committee team, thank you for all the work that you did. We couldn't have done this without your help, and thank you for making this day possible. As a reminder, all videos from today will be posted to the @Scale Facebook page, as well as the @Scale conference website after the event. Thank you.